Good evening. Nothing has perhaps caused more terror, fear, anxiety, paranoia than terrorism since 2001. Whether you have experienced terrorism or not, our lives are shaped by it on a daily basis. There is in fact not a universal definition of terrorism. There are approximately 300 of them. And many often refer to the old cliche that terrorism is like pornography. You know what it is when you see it. But the most obvious place to start, perhaps, when talking about terrorism is the 9/11 attack in 2001. And this attack has become emblematic of terrorism, in which terrorists attack civilians in a seemingly indiscriminate manner. And so for a terrorism scholar, I want to understand how such acts become possible, but also, what are we doing to prevent them? So today I want to make the case that preventing terrorism is a millennial challenge, but perhaps not for the reason that most of you might expect. To prevent terrorism after 9/11, the United States and its partners declared a war on terror. And in that war on terror, there was a key narrative, namely that we were now faced with a new terrorism. So whereas the good old terrorists wanted to set off a bomb to get the seat at the negotiation table, the new terrorists wanted to blow up the negotiation table and everyone around it. The new terrorists did not value life, and they did not seek ordinary political goals. It was only a matter of when and not if the West would suffer its first WMD attack. We had horrifying images and scenarios of a mushroom cloud rising above Manhattan. In addition, we had estimates in 2002 that there were between 2,000 and 4,000 Al-Qaeda operatives on the loose in America. This made terrorism seem like an existential threat supported by a culture of fear. Now, 17 years later, it seems reasonable to evaluate the war on terror and ask, has it made us any safer? Importantly, has it prevented terrorism? And I believe the short answer is no. So if you look at the war on terror, it has included two large-scale military campaigns. And these campaigns have led to almost over 1 million civilian casualties. It has led to millions more being internally displaced. Almost 10,000 coalition soldiers have died. And for the US alone, we're talking a price tag of $3 trillion when everything is said and done. In addition, we can speak of the chaos that the war in Iraq created that helped ISIS establish itself and spread its misery. In addition to the wars and the military campaigns, we've had widespread government surveillance. We've had cases of torture and human rights abuse. We had a rampant drone program. And we had a great many security-enhancing efforts at airports, schools, universities, and in city centers, as I'm sure most of you are aware of. And yet, we seem to be living in an age with increasing terrorism and political violence, for instance, in Europe. So what I want to say is that despite all these efforts, and governments are now stating that we need to devote more resources to countering terrorism, it is tempting to conclude that so far, the only thing contemporary counterterrorism has done is that it has made terrorism into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, of course, there could be a stream of terrorists coming to attack us, or maybe extremists have become really good at radicalizing vulnerable young people. In addition, there are some who say that the civil war in Syria and the rising or the higher levels of immigration to Europe are a cause of terrorism. But what is conspicuously missing from the mainstream debate is that the potential cause that maybe violence creates more violence. Tonight, therefore, I want to draw your attention to one reason in particular for why the war on terror has failed and why it will continue to fail. Underlying contemporary counterterrorism is an assumption, a belief, that violence can be good. This assumption is deeply rooted in Western countries, so much so that we often take it for granted. We don't even question it or find it weird that it can always be used as a tool to resolve a conflict or a situation, for instance, in movies. It has become what John Stuart Mill would call a dead dogma. In movies depicting life in the Old West, it was the gunslinger who got rid of the bad guys, while the non-violent townfolk stood passive and idly by. Or consider a case of a modern gunslinger, perhaps. Most of the media and the Democratic Party may not like what President Trump is doing politically at home, but they all seem to agree that he acts presidential when he sends drones and missiles to faraway countries, or when he talks about torturing the families of alleged terrorists. Suddenly, President Trump is being bigly presidential. Another aspect of this assumption is that violence is neutral. It's like a hammer. You can pick it up whenever you want to. And it stops and begins whenever you want to. This line of thinking is perhaps best summarized by former President Jimmy Carter. At a press conference in 1980, he was asked whether the US and the UK backed coup in Iran in 1953, which helped bring the Shah back to power, whether those events helped lead to the revolution in 78-79. Bear in mind, Jimmy Carter was speaking in 1980. Jimmy Carter then said, well, 1953, those events were ancient history. Well, maybe to Jimmy Carter, those events were ancient history. But for the people of Iran who had to endure massive violence and repression from the Shah's security forces, they lived the events viscerally and corporally every day. And Carter's belittling of the Iranian situation is similar to contemporary counterterrorism's failure to understand that it has a similar impact on the countries in which it operates. In contrast, Robert Young argues that violence is a phenomenon with a history. It is always a double act of violence and counter-violence. Acts of violence do not cancel each other out. They simply accumulate, add new layers of meaning to a context, creating the violent debris of history. As such, acts of violence can often seem senseless, but they are rarely without any kind of meaning. For example, to most people here, I guess, 9/11 came out of the blue. But a report from the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank in America from 1998, shows a bit more difficult, complex story. This Cato report sought to investigate a claim made by the Pentagon's Defense Science Board that there was a strong correlation between US military involvement abroad and terrorist attacks against US interests. And the report did indeed find evidence to support this claim, and they labeled US military intervention abroad a lightning rod of terrorism. But what's really interesting in this report, because it examines terrorist attacks since 1900s, is that from 93, 95, 96, 97, 98, there are numerous mentions of one Osama bin Laden organizing and perpetrating attacks against the US because of US presence in Saudi Arabia and US support of Israel. And we have this going on throughout the whole 90s. And then in 1998, after bin Laden has organized attack on US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, the Clinton administration attacks bin Laden's training camp in Afghanistan with cruise missiles. Now, of course, bin Laden responded a couple of years later on an event that interpolated even more people into this violent repetition effect of violence and counter-violence. Now, what happened also between bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and United States was that they were trapped in this repetition effect of violence, and they could not free themselves from this repetition effect by using more violence. Indeed, this, I believe, is the crux of the matter today. The illusion of good violence prevents us from seeing that violence begets violence. Now, we may think we only need better weapons. Perhaps we need better technology, and someday we will get it right. But if violence is part of the lived experiences of people, if it shapes people in a dialectic manner, then violence should be rejected as a means to prevent terrorism in the future. The question then becomes, what can we do to prevent terrorism? Well, the first thing I want to suggest is actually an old Enlightenment principle, dare to know. This is exactly what contemporary counterterrorism won't do, but something that we all must do. For example, on a personal level, it might involve reflecting on the use of violence. Notice the next time you watch a movie how easy, effective, and seemingly obvious violence can be to resolve a situation or a problem. Conversely, notice how non-violent alternatives are rendered passive, weak, ineffective, or just simply ignored. Second, study and explore the literature on non-violence. For instance, Maria Stephan and Erica Chenoweth has conducted a extensive study on violent versus non-violent campaigns. And they find that the likelihood of a country being a democracy 5 years after that campaign ends is 57% for non-violent campaigns and less than 6% for violent campaigns. Thus, if you dare to know and look, you will find research that challenges the utility and effectiveness of violence and provide empirical evidence for why non-violent alternatives are better. Third, civil resistance works even in the face of a brutal enemy such as ISIS. We know of cases where civil resistance has prevented ISIS from arresting people and destroying local infrastructure. But the point here is, as many scholars have argued, groups like ISIS requires territory to exert its political and religious control. Thus, its power base is fluid, and it depends on the active and passive cooperation of a great number of social groups. Thus, civil resistance strategies and techniques can work to weaken, contain, and perhaps also defeat such groups. While there are no silver bullet of counterterrorism, civil resistance and non-violence does one very important thing. By not using violence, we are not interpolating more people into a repetition effect of violence and counter-violence. For example, to get rid of the threat that was Saddam Hussein in Iraq, the point was to use military force, remove Saddam Hussein, and once he was gone, Iraq would be ready for free market capitalism and democracy. But what the use of violence did was that it closed down the space for ordinary Iraqis to come together, engage in politics, and carve out a meaningful existence for themselves. The means we use have to be commensurate with the ends we want to achieve. And as Gandhi once pointed out, you cannot get a beautiful rose by planting a noxious weed. To conclude then, preventing terrorism is not a millennial challenge because it's all about how to capture or kill terrorists. That's easy enough. But we have to get rid of the illusion that violence is good, and at the very least recognize the fact that if we use violence, we will create more violence in the future. So to prevent terrorism in the future requires that we all challenge, rethink, and ultimately replace violence as a means to create peace and stability and thereby prevent terrorism. Preventing terrorism is truly a millennial challenge that I hope you are all ready for. It is possible, but only if we dare to know and if we dare to act. Thank you.